So today's daf is Daf Ayin. So we'll start from the new Mishnah on Samech Tet Amud Bet. So we know that on the 14th of Nisan, two korbanot were generally brought. One was Korban Pesach, of course. The other one was Korban Chagiga. But there were two korbanot called Chagiga that are brought on Pesach. One is this is unique only to Pesach, that on all Chagim there was a concept of Korban Chagiga on the day of the holiday, including Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuot. You would bring a Korban Chagiga, Olat Re'iyah and Korban Chagiga. These were two korbanot that you would bring on the day of the holiday. But on Pesach there was a unique phenomenon of what's called Chagigat Arba'a Asar, which is that you would bring on Erev Pesach, together with the Korban Pesach, also a Chagiga that would be eaten at the dinner. And that's why we have the two symbolic foods. We have the Zroa and we have the Betzah. These represent the two offerings that were eaten at the seder. Well, the egg is the chagiga, the zroa is the korban pesach. Now, when do you bring the chagiga? So you have a few conditions. So first of all, erev Yom Tov. There's two. There's a chagigat chamisha asar, which is like every holiday has a chagiga. And then with the korban pesach is also on erev pesach you would also bring the korban chagiga, so you would eat it at night. So you eat it the first night of the holiday. Most of the time the Korban Chagiga would be eaten during the day of the holiday. But on Pesach it's eaten also at night. So when do you bring Chagiga with it? So you have a few conditions. It has to be a weekday. In other words, Erev Pesach cannot be on Shabbat. Betahura, when the Korban Pesach is coming, Betahura, because we learned a few times that the Korban Pesach can be brought also Bitum'ah. If the majority of the community is Tameh, they still bring it. Uv Mu'at. And only when there is a little bit, meaning to say that there are a lot of people. What they would do is you would sign up on a Korban Pesach. And if you had a lot of people coming to your Korban Pesach, you needed to have other things to serve them, right? Because there's not enough meat in the Korban Pesach. Let's say 30 people are coming. How many kezetim, how many pieces of Korban Pesach do you have to pass around? You have 50 people at the seder. Each person needs a piece, but that's not dinner. What are they going to eat for dinner? So the Korban Chagiga. But if you had, let's say, only two people, you and your wife have the Korban Pesach, there's too much already. You don't need Korban Chagiga because you're not going to eat two full animals at the night of Pesach. Ubazman shubab b'Shabbat b'mrubeh u'betum'ah en mevini mo Chagiga. So in the case where Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat, so we're already bending the rules of Shabbat to bring the Korban Pesach. We don't go that far to bring the Korban Chagiga. Moreover, bimrubeh, if you have plenty of meat from your Korban Pesach, you don't need the Korban Chagiga to supplement it. And bitum'ah, where we are already suspending the rules of tum'ah, of impurity, to bring the Korban Pesach, afilu bitum'ah, we're not going to break the rule of tum'ah also to bring the Korban Chagiga. It's extra. So what is it basically saying? It's saying that the Korban Chagiga is a supplement to the Korban Pesach, but it's not a chiyuv in its own right. It's not an obligation in its own right. So therefore, when it's not needed, we don't bring it. We only bring it when it's needed, and we only bring it when it doesn't involve any other conflicts, such as Shabbat or tum'ah in this case. So in those cases, en mevin chagiga. So chagiga hayta ba min aton min abakar min akvasim min aizim min azacharim min akevot v'nechelet l'shnei yamim v'layla echad. So this is a contrast with Korban Pesach that's being made here in the Mishnah. That Korban Pesach can be brought min akvasim u min aizim. It can be brought from a sheep or a goat, but it can only be a male goat or a male sheep. A Korban Chagiga can be any type of animal. It can be min bakar. It could be a cow also. In other words, it could also be a par, a bull, let's say, for example. It could be a sheep, it could be a goat, it could be male or female. So it doesn't necessarily follow the rules of Korban Pesach. And we know that Korban Pesach can only be eaten the night of Pesach, right? You can't eat it the next morning. And according to some, you can't even eat it past Chatzot on the night of Pesach. But Korban Chagiga, you have what? Shnei Yamim v'layla echad, which is like any other Korban Shlamim. We read in Ezehu Makaman Shel Zebachim every day that you have a Korban Shlamim, you get 2 days and a night to eat it. So Korban Chagiga does not follow the rules of Korban Pesach. That's basically what the Mishnah is saying. Even though it comes together with the Korban Pesach, it doesn't follow the rules of Korban Pesach. It doesn't have the power of Korban Pesach, which means that it doesn't have the ability to override the laws of Tum'ah or to override the laws of Shabbat. And it doesn't have the restrictions of Pesach, such that it would have to be only a sheep or a goat, and it would have all of these other requirements, and it would have to be eaten only the night of Pesach.
So the Mishnah doesn't talk the location. If it's qualified like the Shalamim, does it have to be within the bounds of Yerushalayim, or could they?
The Chagigah follows like the rules of a Shlamim.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I have a question. Chagigah, it's together with Korban Pesach.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it has to be Yerushalayim. How are you doing Korban Pesach and Chagigah at the same time, no?
Right, you eat it at the same time, but you could continue eating. Let's say you want leftovers. So you could keep the Chagigah for tomorrow. We didn't finish it, so we'll have it tomorrow for leftovers. The Korban Pesach, you're not allowed to. Once the night is over, that's it. And let's say you like beef. You don't like lamb. So you bring the Korban Chagigah from a par instead of, that's okay. So yeah, you could bring from anything. You have regular steak.
So three korbanot at the same time?
Yeah, you had two. So the dinner would be the Korban Chagigah, and then you would conclude, Ein maftirin achar Pesach hafikoman. The last thing you would eat is Korban Pesach. So the Gemara says, Mai tana de ketane Chagigah. So what is this? What is the context here? Why are we all of a sudden discussing the Korban Chagigah? We weren't discussing Korban Chagigah before. So where do we get this from? So the answer is because because in the previous Mishnah, what did we talk about? We talked about how Korban Pesach overrides the laws of Shabbat, but not carrying it to the Beit HaMikdash, not bringing it from outside the Tchum. What are the limits on Pesach overriding Shabbat? And on that note, we said the katane nami chagiga tiladachya Shabbat. So we bring other things that don't override Shabbat. V'achi kamar, and this is what it means. So what is the essential reason why it's brought here? Because of the context of things that do not override Shabbat. So really, it says, when do we bring a chagiga with the Korban Pesach? When it is bachol b'taura v'mu'at. In other words, it fits perfectly in with the context of the previous Mishnah, which was discussing things that don't override Shabbat, and so too the Korban Chagigah doesn't override Shabbat. And then Amar Rav Ashi says, Shema mina, we learn from this Chagigat Arba Asar Lav Chovahi. We see that the Korban that you bring on Erev Pesach, this Chagigah is not an obligation. The Korban Chagigah that you bring during the day of the Yom Tov is considered an obligation. You must bring it. But the Korban Chagigah on Erev Pesach is not. How do you see that? Because if you were to think that it is a chovah, it's an obligation, then regardless of whether it's Shabbat, whether you have enough to eat already, okay, whether it's bitum'ah, still you should have to bring it. Right? In other words, you should still have to bring it because it's an absolute obligation. It doesn't matter about your situation. So what that you don't have enough people to eat your Korban Pesach and you don't need more meat? So what that it's bitum'ah? All these rules shouldn't matter. The Korban Chagigah, if it's an obligation, it's an obligation, right? So if that's the case, so if that's the case, then that it's not a chovah, that it's not absolute, it's relative. When you need it and when there's no other conflicts, then you bring it. Right? So if that's the reason, if that's the truth, so where do we get the obligation from? Kedetanya, as it says in the Braita, Chagigah haba ima Pesach nechelet tchila, kedei sheyeh Pesach nechal ala sova. That Chagigah, the Korban Chagigah of Erev Pesach is brought in order that it should be eaten first, and the Korban Pesach should be ne'echal ala sova, which means you eat the Korban Pesach only for the mitzvah. How do I know I'm eating it only for the mitzvah? Because I'm already full. I had a good dinner, and now I'm eating the Korban Pesach just as my dessert. It's just going to complete the meal. It's ala sova. So the Korban Chagigah is an obligation, but not the same level of obligation. It's not an absolute obligation. It's an obligation. It serves a function. It serves a function. So when the function doesn't contradict anything else, it doesn't conflict with anything else, it's okay. When it poses other issues, you're bringing the Korban Pesach bitum'ah, you're bringing it on Shabbat. There, we don't bring the Korban Chagigah. So now the Gemara goes on and says, we said that the Korban Chagigah has the rules, not of a Korban Pesach, but of a regular Shalamim, which means the time limit on eating the Korban Chagigah. You didn't finish your Korban Chagigah of the night of Pesach, we're talking about. So, what do you say? Oh, we'll save it for tomorrow. We'll put it away for leftovers. Korban Pesach, you can't do that. Korban Pesach, once the night is over, that's it. So, matnitin delaka ben tema. Clearly, our Mishnah doesn't follow the opinion of ben tema. What's ben tema? Aditani, as it says in the Braita, ben tema omer chagigah ba'ima Pesach harihu Pesach. According to ben tema, the chagigah that comes with the Korban Pesach is the same as the Korban Pesach. How so? Ve'ina nechelet ela liyom v'layla. You only have one day and one night to eat it. In other words, the day that what it means by day and night is Erev Pesach, you slaughter the Korban Chagigah. And that night you're allowed to eat it. You can't eat it after that. Just like the Korban Pesach, you're not allowed to eat it the next day. You're not allowed to eat Korban Chagigah the next day. Whereas the Korban Chagigah that you bring on the day of Pesach, on the Yom Tov, that you have 2 days and a night to eat it. You can eat, let's say, Pesach falls out on Thursday, or Pesach falls out on whatever. So you can eat it on Thursday and also Friday. That Korban. But the Korban of the night of Pesach, let's say it's Wednesday night, so that Korban Pesach, okay, that Korban Chagigah of the night of Pesach has the same rules as the Korban Pesach itself, according to Ben Tema. V'chagigat 14 yotze ba mishum simcha, ve'en yotze ba mishum chagigah. And the Korban Chagigat 14, you can use it. Let's say for some reason you set aside a Korban Chagigah for the night of Pesach. You're going to eat this at the night of Leila Seder. You're going to eat it on the night of the Seder. But for some reason you didn't end up doing shechita. You didn't end up preparing it. You left it over. So you can now take that Korban and offer it on the daytime of Pesach and fulfill the mitzvah of what's called Shalmei Simcha. Shalmei Simcha are korbanot that we bring on Yom Tov in order to eat the meat, because the more meat you have on Yom Tov, the better, right? You're supposed to have meat. That's called Shalmei Simcha. However, you can't use it for Chagigah. So what does this mean, Chagigah? On the day of Yom Tov, in the olden days, so there were 2 korbanot that you had to bring. One was called Olat Re'iyah. Olat Re'iyah is burned completely. It's Korban Olah. Korban Chagigah. Now this was true on all of the Chagim. Sukkot, when you came to the Beit HaMikdash, on the daytime you would bring Korban Chagigah and Olat Re'iyah. On Shavuot, Olat Re'iyah, Korban Chagigah, in the daytime. Pesach also, during the day, Olat Re'iyah, Korban Chagigah when you come to the Beit HaMikdash. Everyone had to do that, okay? These are 2 chovot. You have to bring them. What's Shalmei Simcha? That means, let's say you have 30 people in your family. You have 30 people. So you brought a Korban Chagigah, how much are they going to get from that? 1 taste. They're going to be full? No. So what do? You bring Shalmei Simcha. You bring more Shilamim. You bring more Korbanot, and now everyone has meat. So that's not an obligation, because if your family is small and you don't need it, you don't need to bring extra. But if you need it, you bring extra. So you're allowed to use any kind of korban for that. Let's say you had a korban set aside for nidarim and nidavot. You had extra korbanot that you were going to bring anyway. So bring them on Shavuot, and you can eat the meat with your family. It's a good idea, right? So what it's saying here is, let's say you had a korban chagigah that you were going to bring on Erev Pesach for the nighttime of Pesach, and you didn't bring it. So bring it on the daytime of Pesach as Shalmei Simcha. What can you not do? You can't use it as your Korban Chagigah of the daytime. Why? Because the Korban Chagigah of the daytime of Pesach, like the Olat Re'iyah of the daytime of Pesach, is an obligation. You can't take a Korban that you set aside for one thing and fulfill an obligation on another thing. But Shalmei Simcha on the daytime of Pesach, which is unlimited. If you need it, you bring it. If you don't need it, you don't bring it. There, you can take any korban that you had left over that you were going to bring, and you can bring it. So he says you can bring that. You can bring this Chagigat Arba'a Asar, this offering that you were planning to bring for the night of the Seder, but you didn't bring. You can bring it for your extra korbanot during Pesach, but not for your main obligatory korbanot on Pesach. Okay? Now, the main point here, though, of Ben Tema, is that he's telling us that the restrictions of this korban, once you've offered this korban on Erev Pesach, and you're going to eat it at the Seder, just like you have to finish up your leftovers at the night from Korban Pesach, you can't leave it over. You can't leave over the Chagigah either. This is against our Mishnah. Okay? Now, my Ta'amad de Ben Tema, where does he get this idea from? Okay, it's just like Rav Chia taught. Just like Rav taught L'Chia Brei to Chia his son. V'lo yalin laboker zevach chag haPasach. It says you can't leave over to the morning the offering of the holiday of Pesach. Zevach chag ze chagigah haPesach kemashma'o. It's referring to 2 different things. Zevach chag, okay, the offering of the holiday, and Pesach, meaning both offerings that you eat on the night of Pesach can't be left over till the morning. Who is that according to? Only according to Ben Tema. Because according to the Chachamim, you can leave the Chagigah that you ate at night over to the next day. It's no problem. It's only according to Ben Tema. So, V'amar Rachmana lo yalin. And the Torah is telling you you're not allowed to leave it over. So that's where Ben Tema gets his idea. That the 2 korbanot of the night, both of them can't be left over because of the extra word, Zevach Chag HaPesach. okay, instead of just Zevach HaPesach. So next, they asked a question. According to Ben Tema, nechelet tzali or ein nechelet tzali? Does the korban pesach have to be roasted? We know the korban pesach has to be roasted. What about the korban chagiga of the night of Pesach? Does it also have to be roasted? In other words, you're telling me.
How do you do it different if you bring the Pesahim Daf? What they do? They don't have a microwave.
No, you have to roast it.
Huh?
Korban pesach has to be roasted.
Okay.
For sure.
So
And what? The other korbanot, usually you can do whatever you want, right?
Are you sure?
Usually you could boil it, you could roast it, you could do whatever you want. Most of them.
You have only grills.
Right, they had barbecue probably, or they would go home. Like people would stay in people's houses. They had pots and stuff.
You should do the Bet HaMikdash and they take home.
Korban shlamim and things like that they could bring home. They bring it home and cook it at home. So the question is what kind of cooking? Because we learned that bechol ma'achal. You know when it says in Ezra Mukaman bechol ma'achal yom v'layla. Bechol ma'achal means any type of preparation. You want to boil it. You want stick tartar. You want whatever you want. It could be whatever you want. Fine. Now, what is the? So the question is, Ben Tema is telling us that this Korban Chagiga has to exactly match the Korban Pesach. How far does he go? So does it also have to be roasted? So. Are you telling me that the Torah is only telling us the comparison of the Chagiga of Pesach night to the Korban Pesach only with respect to the deadline of eating it? But everything else, they're different. Or maybe you're telling me that this chagiga that we eat on the night of Pesach is similar to the Korban Pesach in all respects, even with respect to how you have to prepare it. Tashma, come and listen. Halayla hazek kulo tzali. V'amar Rav Chisda zo divrei ben tema shema mina. So what is this talking about? In the questions, the 4 questions that we read, right? Yeah. So and the 4 questions, the Manishtana, they used to say. On all the other nights we would eat mivushal, vishaluk, vitzali, you could eat whatever you want. But tonight, everything has to be tzali. Everything has to be roasted. So who says everything has to be roasted? That must be, Rav Chisda said, that's talking about Ben Tema. According to Ben Tema, everything was roasted the night of Pesach, meaning both korbanot had to be roasted. You couldn't boil one meat and roast the korban Pesach. They asked a question, Ben Tema, ba min bakar o ena ba min bakar? I'm sorry, ba min bakar o ena ba min bakar? Ba min nekevot o ena ba min nekevot? Ba bat shtei shanim o ena bat shtei shanim? So there were a few differences between a korban pesach and a korban shlamim. A korban shlamim, like we said, it can come from cattle, not just from sheep. Okay? We also know that a korban pesach has to be, whereas a korban pesach can only be a sheep or a goat. It can't be from cattle. Okay? A korban pesach has to be a male. I'm sorry. It has to be a. It has to be a male. It can't be a female, right? Whereas a shlamim could be a male or female. And a korban pesach has to be in its first year of life. A korban shlamim could be up to 2 years. Okay, so the question is, on these 3 issues, what do we say? What would Ben Tema say about the chagiga that's eaten with the korban pesach? Does it also have to be only 1 year old? Does it also have to be a sheep or a goat? Does it also have to be a male and not a female? So when it comes to comparing the korban pesach and this korban chagiga, are we saying this only with respect to the way it's eaten, when it's eaten, and how it's eaten, or are we saying even in terms of the characteristics of the animal? So Tashma, come and listen. Chagiga habayim pesach haruka pesach ba min atzon ve'ena ba min abakar ba min azacharim ve'ena ba min nekevot ba bat shenata ve'ena ba bat shtei shanim ve'ena nechelet ela liyom v'layla ve'ena nechelet ela tzali ve'ena nechelet ela limnu yav. So we have a whole list here in a Braita. It says that this chagiga that comes with the korban pesach, the night of Pesach, is exactly like the Pesach. It has to be from sheep or goats. It can't be from cattle. It has to be from males. It can't be from females. It has to be in its first year of life. It can't be in its second year of life. It can't be eaten past the first night of Pesach, and it can only be eaten roasted, and it can only be eaten limnu yav, meaning just like the korban Pesach, you have to sign up for it. Right, you have to sign up. You have to register for the korban Pesach. You can't just come to anybody's house. Minu yav, right? Yeah. So too here. It has to be limnu yav. It has to be that you signed up for it. So what is that saying? That in every respect, this chagiga of the night of Pesach is the same as a Korban Pesach.
What would happen if today we had the Mikdash and we have 6 million people? No, seriously.
You would have to, it would be very difficult. In any, in any Korban Pesach, they had many people are tamei, so they don't bring it. It's never the whole population bringing it. It's always a segment of the population because you have, a lot of people are tamei there, derech rechuka. So then, with the people who are in Israel and capable of coming, right? You would have to have. They had it only in 3 shifts back then. Even for the whole Am Yisrael, they had only 3 shifts, and that was for everybody. So they didn't have that many people who were qualified to bring it every year because you had to be in the right place, you had to be in Yerushalayim, you had to be tahor. There were lots of rules. So you're right, though. It would be very hard today. I can't imagine how they're going to do it in the future Beit HaMikdash. We'll see. So they'll figure it out. They'll have some kind of system set up, really productive, really efficient system, probably. But what do we see here? So we see from this, who could this Breita possibly follow? Only Ben Tema, because Ben Tema is the person who's thinking along these lines to compare the 2 korbanot. So it must be that he holds that in every respect they're the same. Now, what do we see from this? Incidentally, we see that just to point out, now the daytime of Pesach. What rules apply to the korban of the daytime of Pesach? None of these rules. You understand that, right? Everybody agrees that on the daytime of Pesach, when you bring the Chagigah, it's a regular Korban Chagigah. It's a regular Korban Shalamim. The only time we're applying all these rules, according to Ben Tema, is the nighttime of Pesach. Because it's a unique Korban that's only brought for one holiday, only brought for Pesach, and it's brought together with Korban Pesach, so it matches Korban Pesach. But during the daytime, you don't have any of these rules in place. Now, Ibailu, they asked the question, the Ben Tema yesh ba mishum shevirat etzem, o en ba mishum shevirat etzem. Afal gav dikiak Rahman ala Pesach amar bo velo b'chagiga o dilba, hay bo b'kasher velo b'pasul da'ata. So the question is like this, okay, we've compared Korban Pesach and Chagiga in so many different ways, according to Ben Tema. How far does he go? Is there a prohibition of shevirat etzem? Shevirat etzem is ve'etzem lo tishberuvo. You're not allowed to break a bone of the Korban Pesach. What about the Korban Chagiga? According to Ben Tema, that we apply all the rules, the same to both. Okay? So what would he say about the Chagiga? So do we say that we compare them in all... do we say that the Pasuk says, ve'etzem lo tishberuvo, only the Korban Pesach has that rule, not the Chagiga? Or do we say... no, that just like we're going to the word vo, etzem lo tishberu vo means bakasher velo bapasul. That means when the Korban Pesach is kasher, there's a rule that you can't break the bone. But when the Korban Pesach is pasul, then breaking the bone is not a problem because the Korban Pesach is already pasul. But according to Ben Tema, both the Korban Pesach and the Korban Chagiga will have the rule that you can't break the bone. That's the question. So, Tashma, let's try to figure this out. And we come to a Mishnah from Masechet Shekalim, which is actually the next Masechet in the Daf Yomi cycle. Sakin shenimtzet b'arba'asar. If you were to find, generally we have a presumption that if you find kelim, you find vessels in Yerushalayim, we assume that they're tahor. We give them cheskat tahora. Why? Because many things were going on with holy objects in Yerushalayim all the time. So we assume that people kept things at a high level of purity because they didn't want to compromise the purity. So what happens here? So sakin shenimtzet b'arba'asar, you find a knife on the 14th of Nisan. So what do you assume about it? So shochait b'miyad, you can use it right away. Presumption is, whoever's knife this is, they made sure that it was tahor because the 14th of Nisan is a big shechita day. Right? We don't have to worry. Bishlosha asar. However, if you found it on the 13th of Nisan, the day before, shoneu matbil, you have to go in tevilah. You have to make tevilah again. Why do you have to make tevilah? Why do you have to bring it to the mikveh again? Because there's a concern that maybe this person was planning to bring it to tevilah today. It's the 13th of Nisan for tomorrow, but he didn't get there yet. He didn't get to the mikveh yet. On the 14th, we assume he did it yesterday and it was done. But today, on the 13th, maybe he hadn't done it yet. So you have to go and bring it to the mikveh. Kofitz, if you have a butcher's knife, this is like a cleaver. This isn't like a knife that's used for shechita usually. It can be used for shechita, but it's not generally. It's usually used for butchering meat. Ben bazeh ven bazeh shoneu matbil. You can't give it a chezkat tahora. You must bring it to the mikveh. So if you found it on the 13th of Nisan, you would bring it, and if you found it on the 14th of Nisan, you would also bring it to tevilah. What's the difference? So Mani, who is this Mishnah following? So what is the Gemara trying to infer from this? It's inferring as follows. We know that the Rabbanan, the rabbis say that this Korban Chagigah that you bring on the night of Pesach is totally different than the Korban Pesach itself. Korban Pesach itself has all kinds of restrictions. The Korban Chagigah of the night is just a regular Korban. So you can't break the bones of a Korban Chagigah. Of the Korban Pesach. But you could definitely break the bones of the Korban Chagigah. So if you find a butcher's knife on the 14th of Nisan, we should assume that it's probably also tahor. Because what was the person thinking? I can't use this butcher's knife to break the bones of my Korban Pesach, but I can use it for my Chagigah. So of course I want it to be tahor. However, according to Ben Tema, the Mishnah makes sense. The Mishnah is telling you, don't assume that the butcher's knife is tahor. Why not? Because nobody needs a butcher's knife on the night of Pesach. Why don't they need a butcher's knife on the night of Pesach? Because according to Ben Tema, you can't break the bones, not of the Korban Pesach and not of the Korban Chagigah. So what do you need this cleaver for? You don't need it. So if you find it, you assume it's probably not tahor. So this Mishnah supports Ben Tema, because it says that there's a difference between a knife that's used for breaking bones, usually, and a knife that is used for shechita. Only according to Ben Tema. According to the Chachamim, it wouldn't make sense. According to the Chachamim, why don't you need also the cleaver? Because you're going to break the bones of your other korban. Must be that Ben Tema says you don't break the bones of the Chagigah. Lo, the Olam Rabbanan. No, we're not going to accept this. We're going to say that really it's the rabbis. You can't prove it. You can't prove that Ben Tema holds that you can't break the bones of a Chagigah. Why not? Because we could say that even according to the rabbis, there's a difference between kofitz, between this kind of a cleaver that's used for butchering meat and a knife for shechita. How so? Because ukigon Shabbat b'Shabbat. Because maybe that year, Erev Pesach fell on Shabbat. And if Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat, you know that you're not going to have a Korban Chagigah with your Korban Pesach. Right? Because we said that you only bring the supplemental Chagigah when it falls B'chol, on the weekdays. This year it fell on Shabbat, so you're not going to be bringing the Korban Chagigah, so they didn't bother, since on the night of Pesach, what are you going to need? Only Korban Pesach. You're not going to have Korban Chagigah, so you're not going to be breaking any bones. So that's why you didn't need that knife. That's why when you find the kofitz, you find the butcher's knife, you say it's probably not tahor, because the person knew they're not going to be able to have any meat tonight that the bones are breakable. Okay, but normally maybe we wouldn't apply that. Normally we could say that that the kofitz would be tahor also, because it would be used for butchering up the meat of the Chagigah. But wait a second, that doesn't work, because at the end of the Mishnah it says chalar ba'asar liot b'Shabbat shochait b'miyad. It says that if the 14th of Nisan fell on Shabbat and you find a knife, you can use it right away. And if you find it on the 15th of Nisan, you can also use it immediately. Nimtzet kofitz kishura l'sakin harika sakin. And if you find the kofitz, you found the butcher's knife tied to the shechita knife, then you can use it immediately. So in other words, if you were to find on the 14th of Nisan or the 15th of Nisan this kofitz, you were to find this butcher's knife, you can use it. If the 14th of Nisan is Shabbat, you can use it. If the 15th of Nisan is Shabbat, you can use it. I'm sorry, if you found it on the 15th of Nisan, you can use it immediately. Miklal dereisha lav b'Shabbat askinan. Which means what? That the beginning of the Mishnah that said that when you found the butcher's knife on the 13th or the 14th, that we consider it tameh, it's not talking about when it fell out on Shabbat. It's not because you don't have a Korban Chagigah. Because if we're talking about where you didn't have a Korban Chagigah, if we're talking about Shabbat, the end of the Mishnah doesn't make any sense, because the end of the Mishnah says, if the 14th of Nisan is a Shabbat, then you can assume it's tahor. You can assume even the kofitz is tahor, it means. You can assume even the butcher's knife is tahor. That's the opposite. You're telling me that no, when it falls on Shabbat, that's when the Chachamim are saying, you didn't need the kofitz to be tahor. And the Mishnah actually at the end is saying, no, when it's on Shabbat, that's when you can assume it is tahor. So it can't be that when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat, so therefore there's no Korban Chagigah, that's the only time that the rabbis are telling you that the butcher's knife wouldn't have been purified beforehand. It's the opposite actually. When you find it on Shabbat, that's the 14th of Nisan is Shabbat, that's when you assume it is tahor. So it has nothing to do with whether the Korban Chagigah is coming or not. So ve'ela sheba b'mrubeh. Rather, it must be talking about a case where there is a lot. In other words, where you're coming in a small group, and since there's a small group bringing the Korban Pesach, they don't need the Korban Chagigah. And since they didn't need the Korban Chagigah, they knew that they weren't going to be butchering any meat at night because they couldn't break any bones. All they were going to have was Korban Pesach. And therefore, they didn't purify their butcher's knife. The Gemara says, but wait a second. Mina yad'eh. How are you going to know in advance how many people are going to sign up for your Korban Pesach? You're so sure. On the 13th of Nisan, when you're deciding whether to immerse your vessels or not, you already know how much meat you're going to have and whether you're going to need Korban Chagigah? No, you're going to immerse everything just in case you need it. On the 13th, you're going to immerse everything. You're going to assume that you're going to need it for the Korban Chagigah too. So then the Gemara says, Ve'ela sheba betum'am. Maybe we're talking about a case where the entire community or the majority of the Jewish people are tameh. And since they are tameh, this person didn't bother to immerse the kofitz. Why? Because when the Korban Pesach is coming betum'ah, we don't bring the Korban Chagigah at all. And therefore, since we're not bringing the Korban Chagigah at all, there's no concern that we're going to have to break any bones tonight.
Yeah, but when the Korban Pesach is brought in Tumah, everybody has to eat. I mean, that's the mitzvah.
Right.
Eating
they have to eat it. Right.
But if they're tameh, how can they eat?
That's it's a special exception. It's a special exception. But I thought you were going to ask a different question, which is, how is this guy worried about whether the knife is tahor if everyone's tameh? Right. So what they explain is that the majority of the community is tameh. Right. The majority of the community is tameh. So therefore, if you find this kofitz, you assume it's also tameh. Why? Because nobody's bringing the Korban Chagigah, but you yourself are tahor. You as an individual are tahor, so you don't need to use a tameh thing. You should use a tahor thing. You yourself are tahor. So what it means is when you find this kofitz, what do you assume about it? Well, since everybody is tameh anyway, nobody's bringing Korban Chagigah, so nobody's going to bother purifying the kofitz. But the Gemara says, but still, sof mina yad'eh. Still, how do you know? How are you going to know? That's something that we find out at the last minute if everybody's tameh or not. How do you know that everyone's going to be tameh this year? And that therefore people are not going to bring the Korban Chagigah? Everyone's going to be preparing, assuming that they're going to bring the Korban Chagigah, and therefore they're going to be immersing all their vessels. No, because demit nasi. Okay, so it must be that the nasi of the Jewish people died. So since the nasi of the Jewish people died, everyone is going to be tameh because it's a mitzvah for everybody to be involved. Therefore, nobody is going to be bringing the Korban Chagigah. Therefore, nobody is purifying their kofitz because there's not going to be any meat, the bones of which you're allowed to break. So then the Gemara says, wait a second. Emat, when did he die? Demit nasi emat. Ilema demit b'shlosha asar. If the nasi died on the 13th of Nisan, sakin lamali demit belay. So if the nasi died on the 13th of Nisan, why are you immersing your knife? Nothing needs to be tahor then. Everyone's going to be tameh anyway. So why are you making a distinction between knife and kofitz? Because remember, the Mishnah makes a distinction. You find a knife, it's tahor. You find a kofitz, it's not, it's tameh. So why are you making a distinction between knife and kofitz if nothing needs to be tahor? Because everybody's tameh. And on the other hand, if you're going to tell me that he died on the 14th of Nisan, so so then on the 13th of Nisan you didn't know anyway. So you would have immersed everything. Why did they do it on the 13th? Because everything had to have two things. It had to be immersed on the 13th of Nisan because it had to have Erev Shemesh. It also had to have that the sun went down, right? So that's why everyone would have had to do it on the 13th of Nisan, not on the 14th. So since everything was done on the 13th, and you didn't know he was going to die then, so of course you immersed everything. Because everybody was planning on having the Korban Chagigah and also having the Korban Pesach. So why should you assume that they knew in advance that he was going to die? So now the Gemara gives a complicated answer, okay? He was goses on the 13th. Everyone was waiting to see, is he going to make it, okay? So sakin the had safek matbila. So when it comes to the knife, you have only one safek. What's the safek? Maybe the nasi is going to die, and we're going to bring the Korban Pesach betum'ah. But you know what? Just in case, we might bring it betahora, so I'd better immerse my knife. However, kofitz, okay, so the butcher's knife, the trei sefeke, you have two sefekot. What are the two sefekot? Number one, maybe the nasi is going to die, and we're all going to be tameh anyway, so nobody's going to bring Korban Chagigah. And If we're all tahor, maybe I'm going to have not enough guests this year, and I won't need the korban chagiga for the nighttime anyway. So you have two sfekot, so lo matbilah. He's not going to go out of his way to do tevilah on his kofitz. Now this is obviously what we call a terutz dahuk. It's a very difficult answer. The Mishnah is only talking about a case where the Nasi is about to die and nobody and right. He's goses. He's on his deathbed and everyone's wondering on the 13th of Nisan. So therefore, with the sakin, they made sure to bring it to tevilah. But with the kofitz, they didn't bring it to tevilah because they had two sfekot. It's a very stretched, difficult answer. Why did they want to bring this answer? What was the reason why they brought Terutz Dachuk? Because they wanted to get out of saying that the Mishnah was following only Ben Tema. Because otherwise we have to say that the Mishnah is following a Dat Yachid, which is very unusual because Ben Tema is holding that the Chagigav, the night of Pesach, has to be exactly the same rules as Pesach. So for him it's easy. There's nothing that you're going to break the bones of on the night of Pesach, because you can't break the bones of the Chagigah, you can't break the bones of the Pesach. So therefore, a kofitz you're not going to bring to Tevilah, because you're not going to bring you're not going to break the bones. And if the Korban Pesach in other words, if Pesach falls out on Shabbat, if Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbat, there it's going to be tahor because you had to bring everything to Tevilah on Erev Shabbat for the whole Yom Tov. In other words, even for Yom Tov, that's why. Whereas, in other words, according to Ben Tema, it's very simple. If you find the kofitz on the 14th or 13th of Nisan, you say, well, nobody's going to tovel, nobody's going to bring their kofitz, their butcher's knife to the mikveh today. Why? Because nobody's going to be, on the 13th of Nisan, nobody brought their butcher's knife to the mikveh. Why? Because they know that on the 14th of Nisan, they don't need it. There's nothing you can break the bones. Why on the 14th of Nisan would they bring it? Because tomorrow's Yom Tov, and maybe we're going to need it tomorrow. But on the 13th, they wouldn't have brought it. So it makes sense according to Ben Tema. It's perfect, right? That's why the Mishnah said that if the 14th of Nisan falls out on Shabbat, so then everyone brought it on Friday to the mikveh because they need it not for the night of Pesach, but for the day of Pesach. But according to the Chachamim, why would you make a distinction between a butcher's knife and a regular knife? Should be the same. So that's why they have to bring this complicated terutz that, it's because the Nasi was a goses, and therefore people were making calculations about whether to bring their knife, whether to bring their butcher's knife, and so on. Okay, so now we move on from this. So that the Gemara just brought that. We call that dechiyah ba'alma. Basically, the Gemara brought that to push off what the conclusion, saying it's not absolutely certain that the Mishnah is following Ben Tema. Could be that it's following the Chachamim in a very unusual case. Okay, the Gemara goes on. Tanya, we said in the Braita, Yehuda ben Dortai Peresh. Hu v'Dortai beno. Yehuda ben Dortai and his son Dortai, which is an example, by the way, in the Talmud of how they used to name their kids after the father. Right? This minhag is a very old minhag. So he and his son, ve'alach v'yashav lo badarom, they went to the south. Now some people say this means they went very far to the south of, this means they went to Chutz La'aretz, they went outside of Israel. Okay? Rashi says, Rachok miYerushalayim. What was the reason? That they should be b'derech rechoka, that they wouldn't be obligated to come for the Korban Pesach. Why? Because that year, the Korban Pesach was being brought on Shabbat. Okay? Amar im yavo Eliyahu v'yomer lahem liYisrael mipnei ma lo chagagtem chagiga b'Shabbat ma'hin omrim lo. He used to say, if Eliyahu and Navi would come and say to the Jewish people, why didn't you bring the Korban chagiga on Shabbat? What are we going to tell him? Okay? In other words, according to him, just like Korban Pesach is doche Shabbat, the Korban Chagiga that accompanies the Korban Pesach is also Doche Shabbat. Not like our Mishnah. Not like what our Mishnah said. It is Doche Shabbat. And so he said, Miani al Shnei Tamani al Shnei Gdolei Hador Shemaya v'Avtalyon. I'm shocked at the two great ones of the generation, Shemaya v'Avtalyon, Shen Chachamim Gdolim v'Darshanim Gdolim, who were big Chachamim and great Darshanim, the great explainers of the Torah, V'lo Amru Len L'Yisrael Chagiga Dochat Shabbat, and they never explained to the Jewish people that they have to bring the Korban Chagiga even on Shabbat, just like the Korban Pesach comes on Shabbat, Chagiga comes on Shabbat. This is a radical position. According to our Mishnah, Korban Chagiga is basically voluntary. It's not voluntary, but it's situational. Oh, if it's midioraita, but in other words, it's a mitzvah min Torah if you need it, and if it's not ba b'tuman, it's not Shabbat. It's a mitzvah then. But to say that it's going to override Shabbat is a big chidush. We're going to see in a minute that there's another interpretation of this Gemara. But this is Rashi. So the way Rashi interprets it. So that's what he says. So Amar Rav said, "My ta'amad de ben dortai." What was the reasoning of ben dortai? Where did he get this idea that you should bring the korban chagiga even on Shabbat? Dechtiv v'zavachta pesach l'Hashem Elohecha tzon uvakar. It says you should offer the korban pesach tzon from the flock uvakar and the cattle. What does it mean tzon uvakar? V'alo en pesach ela min ha'kevasim u'min ha'izim. But korban pesach doesn't come tzon uvakar. Tzon means the sheep and goats. Bakar means parim. It means what you call it, cows and so on, and bulls. So what does it mean? Mina kivasim, mina tzonu, mina bakar. How could you tell me that I'm bringing the korban pesach from tzonu bakar? It's not true. Ela tzon ze pesach. When it says bring the korban pesach from tzon, from the flock, it means that's the korban pesach. Bakar. When it says cattle, zo chagiga. That's the chagiga. See? So what does he say? You see from the Torah, v'zavachta pesach tzonu vakar. It's a mitzvah just like the korban pesach, also to bring a chagiga with it that you eat on the night of Pesach, and that's why we represent it, by the way, with the egg. The bitzah represents the chagiga. The zroa represents the korban pesach. Okay? So, va'amar rahmana, and what does the Torah tell you? V'zavachta pesach. That you need to bring both of these, even on Shabbat. That's what the Ben Dortai was saying. Yehuda Ben Dortai was arguing, okay, with the Chachamim. Now, Amar Rav Ashi says, "Va'anan ta'amad de prushim niku v'nifrosh." Are you now explaining the reasoning of people who separate themselves from the Jewish people? That Yehuda ben Dortai was so radical that he actually left Israel so that he wouldn't have to come to the Beit HaMikdash on Shabbat, on Erev Pesach that fell on Shabbat, because he was so strong. He said, I cannot come in good conscience. I'm a conscientious objector, right? I can't come in good conscience and bring only the Pesach and not the Chagigah on Shabbat. That's wrong. You have to bring the Pesach and the Chagigah. We shouldn't be explaining, we shouldn't be justifying the position of a separatist, okay? Rather, what does it mean? It's like Rav Nachman said. Hudata. The Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua, because Rav Nachman said that Rabba bar Avua said, Minayin lamotara pesach shekarev shilamim shenemar v'zavach pesach l'Hashem Elohecha tzon uvakar. That what do we learn from this pasuk? That what happens if a person, for instance, set aside $1,000 to bring a nice korban pesach, but then the price of sheep went down. The sheep market is not doing well. Price went down. He only has to pay $500. He has $500 left over. What does he do with the extra $500 that he set aside for korban pesach? He brings shilamim. What happens if a guy has a sheep that he designated for Pesach and the sheep runs away? So he has to designate a new one. Now the original sheep comes back. What does he do with it? It's called Motara Pesach, leftover Pesach. So what does he do with it? He brings it as a Korban Shalamim. Now, how do we know that? Because it says you should bring the korban pesach as tzon uvakar, from the flock or from the cattle. Does the korban pesach ever come from the cattle? No, it only comes from sheep. It can only come from sheep or goats. What it means when it says you should bring the korban pesach for tzon uvakar, you should bring it as flock or cattle. So what does it mean to say? It means flock or cattle, meaning bring the leftover Pesach, if you have leftover money from the Korban Pesach that you weren't able to spend because the price went down, or you have a leftover Korban Pesach because your Korban Pesach ran away and you had to replace it. So in both of those cases, what do you do with the leftover? You bring it for something that could be either sheep or cattle. What's something that could be either sheep or cattle? Could be either flock or cattle. Shlamim. So you bring it as a shlamim. For Rabbanan and the rabbis, how do they really respond to Yehuda ben Dortai's argument that we should bring this Korban Chagiga even on Shabbat? Because look, it's paired with Korban Pesach. So how do we know that we don't bring Chagiga on Shabbat? Vadai Korban Tziburu, isn't it a public Korban? It's a Korban that the community is bringing, everybody's bringing it, so why don't we do it? Rabbi Ila'a, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda ben Safra. Rabbi Ila'a said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda ben Safra, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, V'chagotem oto chag l'Hashem shivat yamim b'shana. It says regarding Sukkot, bring V'chagotem oto chag l'Hashem. Chagotem comes from the verb chagiga, to bring the korban. right? Chagotem means to bring a korban, really. Chag, that we say Chag Sameach, Chag really comes from korban. Okay, so what it means is you should celebrate before Hashem 7 days, meaning bring korbanot 7 days. Shiva, why does it say 7 days? Shmona havu. There were 8 days of Sukkot because there's Shmini Atzeret. What happened to Shmini Atzeret? Ela mikan l'chagiga she'ena dochat Shabbat. What do you see from here? That Chagiga doesn't override Shabbat. Why? Because at least 1 day of Sukkot is going to be Shabbat. So you never have more than 7 days of korban. You never do. So the Kiyata Ravin Amar, when Ravin came, he said, "Amarti lefnei rabotai pamim shiata motzei ela shisha, kigon shechag yom tov rishon shel chag b'Shabbat." You could actually have situations where you only bring korbanot 6 days. When would you bring only 6 days? When the first day of Sukkot is Shabbat, Shmini Atzeret is also Shabbat. Right? So then there are 2 days. So then you only actually have 6 days. So why does it mention Shiv'ah? So Amar Abaye, Avin Tichla. One who lost children, one who buried his children. Lema ki you're asking such a crazy question. Shmona lo mishkachat la klal, shiva ita berov shanim. The answer is, you never have a case where all 8 days of Sukkot you can bring the korban chagiga. You never do. That's why it doesn't mention Shmona. But shiva, 7 days is the standard. True, there could be a situation where it's only 6, but that's the exception to the rule. The rule is, the usual case is 7. So the Torah says 7 days, even though it's 8. Why? To show you that day that is Shabbat is a day that you can't bring Korban Chagiga. And as Rashi says, if that's true for the Korban Chagiga that's brought on the day of Pesach, then on the day of Pesach, where it's even more of an obligation, you can't bring the Korban Chagiga when it falls on Shabbat. Certainly, the Korban Chagiga of Erev Pesach, which is only comes when you need it, you're not going to bring, and it only comes when there's no other conflict, you're not going to bring when it falls out on Shabbat. There is an opinion in Tosafot that all this discussion about Yehuda ben Dortai is talking not about the Korban Chagiga of Erev Pesach, but about the Korban Chagiga of Pesach itself. But Rashi doesn't interpret it that way. He interprets it as the Erev Pesach one that's eaten together with the Korban Pesach at night, and that's how he interprets the entire approach and the entire development of the sugya here. Have a great day.